Roughing It in the Bush by Susanna Moodie. Chapter 16. Burning the Fallow. There is a hollow roaring in the air, the hideous hissing of 10,000 flames, that from the centre of yon sable cloud leap madly up, like serpents in the dark, shaking their arrowy tongues at nature's heart. It is not my intention to give a regular history of our residence in the bush, but merely to present to my readers such events as may serve to illustrate a life in the woods. The winter and spring of 1834 had passed away. The latter was uncommonly cold and backward, so much so that we had a very heavy fall of snow upon the 14th and 15th of May, and several gentlemen drove down to Cobourg in a sleigh, the snow lying upon the ground to the depth of several inches. A late cold spring in Canada is generally succeeded by a burning hot summer, and the summer of '34 was the hottest I ever remember. No rain fell upon the earth for many weeks, till nature drooped and withered beneath one bright blaze of sunlight, and the ague and fever in the woods, and the cholera in the large towns and cities, spread death and sickness throughout the country. Moodie had made, during the winter, a large clearing of 20 acres around the house. The progress of the workmen had been watched by me with the keenest interest. Every tree that reached the ground opened a wider gap in the dark wood, giving us a broader ray of light and a clearer glimpse of the blue sky. But when the dark cedar swamp fronting the house fell beneath the strokes of the axe, and we got a first view of the lake, my joy was complete. A new and beautiful object was now constantly before me, which gave me the greatest pleasure. By night and day, in sunshine or in storm, water is always the most sublime feature in a landscape, and no view can be truly grand in which it is wanting. From a child, it always had the most powerful effect upon my mind, from the great ocean rolling in majesty to the tinkling forest rill hidden by the flowers and rushes along its banks. Half the solitude of my forest home vanished when the lake unveiled its bright face to the blue heavens, and I saw sun and moon and stars and waving trees reflected there. I would sit for hours at the window as the shades of evening deepened around me, watching the massy foliage of the forests pictured in the waters, till fancy transported me back to England, and the songs of birds and the lowing of cattle were sounding in my ears. It was long, very long, before I could discipline my mind to learn and practise all the menial employments which are necessary in a good settler's wife. The total absence of trees about the doors in all new settlements had always puzzled me, in a country where the intense heat of summer seems to demand all the shade that can be procured. My husband had left several beautiful rock elms, the most picturesque tree in the country, near our dwelling, but alas! the first high gale prostrated all my fine trees, and left our log cottage entirely exposed to the fierce rays of the sun. The confusion of an uncleared fallow spread around us on every side. Huge trunks of trees and piles of brush gave a littered and uncomfortable appearance to the locality, and as the weather had been very dry for some weeks, I heard my husband daily talking with his choppers as to the expediency of firing the fallow. They still urged him to wait a little longer, until he could get a good breeze to carry the fire well through the bush. Business called him suddenly to Toronto, but he left a strict charge with old Thomas and his sons, who were engaged in the job, by no means to attempt to burn it off until he returned, as he wished to be upon the premises himself in case of any danger. He had previously burnt all the heaps immediately about the doors. While he was absent, old Thomas and his second son fell sick with the ague, and went home to their own township, leaving John, a surly, obstinate young man, in charge of the shanty, where they slept and kept their tools and provisions. Monaghan I had sent to fetch up my 3 cows, as the children were languishing for milk, and Mary and I remained alone in the house with the little ones. The day was sultry, and towards noon a strong wind sprang up, that roared in the pine tops like the dashing of distant billows, but without in the least degree abating the heat. The children were lying listlessly upon the floor for coolness, and the girl and I were finishing sunbonnets, when Mary suddenly exclaimed, "Bless us, mistress, what a smoke!" I ran immediately to the door, but was not able to distinguish 10 yards before me. The swamp immediately below us was on fire, and the heavy wind was driving a dense black cloud of smoke directly towards us. "What can this mean?" I cried. "Who can have set fire to the fallow?" As I ceased speaking, John Thomas stood pale and trembling before me. "John, what is the meaning of this fire?" "Oh, ma'am, I hope you will forgive me. It was I set fire to it, and I would give all I have in the world if I had not done it." "What is the danger?" "Oh, I'm terribly afeard that we shall all be burnt up," said the fellow, beginning to whimper. "Why did you run such a risk, and your master from home, and no one on the place to render the least assistance?" "I did it for the best," blubbered the lad. "What shall we do?" "Why, we must get out of it as fast as we can, and leave the house to its fate." "We can't get out," said the man, in a low, hollow tone, which seemed the concentration of fear. "I would have got out of it, if I could, but just step to the back door, ma'am, and see." I had not felt the least alarm up to this minute. I had never seen a fallow burnt, but I had heard of it as a thing of such common occurrence that I had never connected it with any idea of danger. Judge then my surprise, my horror, when on going to the back door I saw that the fellow, to make sure of his work, had fired the field in 50 different places. Behind, before, on every side we were surrounded by a wall of fire, burning furiously within 100 yards of us, and cutting off all possibility of retreat. For could we have found an opening through the burning heaps, we could not have seen our way through the dense canopy of smoke, and buried as we were in the heart of the forest, no one could discover our situation till we were beyond the reach of help. I closed the door, and went back to the parlour. Fear was knocking loudly at my heart, for our utter helplessness annihilated all hope of being able to effect our escape. I felt stupefied. The girl sat upon the floor by the children, who, unconscious of the peril that hung over them, had both fallen asleep. She was silently weeping, while the fool who had caused the mischief was crying aloud. A strange calm succeeded my first alarm. Tears and lamentations were useless. A horrible death was impending over us, and yet I could not believe that we were to die. I sat down upon the step of the door, and watched the awful scene in silence. The fire was raging in the cedar swamp immediately below the ridge on which the house stood, and it presented a spectacle truly appalling. From out the dense folds of a canopy of black smoke, the blackest I ever saw, leapt up continually red forks of lurid flame, as high as the tree tops, igniting the branches of a group of tall pines that had been left standing for saw logs. A deep gloom blotted out the heavens from our sight. The air was filled with fiery particles, which floated even to the doorstep, while the crackling and roaring of the flames might have been heard at a great distance. Could we have reached the lake shore, where several canoes were moored at the landing, by launching out into the water we should have been in perfect safety; but to attain this object, it was necessary to pass through this mimic hell, and not a bird could have flown over it with unscorched wings. There was no hope in that quarter, for, could we have escaped the flames, we should have been blinded and choked by the thick, black, resinous smoke. The fierce wind drove the flames at the sides and back of the house up the clearing, and our passage to the road, or to the forest, on the right and left, was entirely obstructed by a sea of flames. Our only ark of safety was the house, so long as it remained untouched by the consuming element. I turned to young Thomas, and asked him how long he thought that would be. "When the fire clears this little ridge in front, ma'am. The Lord have mercy upon us then, or we must all go." "Cannot you, John, try and make your escape, and see what can be done for us and the poor children?" My eye fell upon the sleeping angels, locked peacefully in each other's arms, and my tears flowed for the first time. Mary, the servant girl, looked piteously up in my face. The good faithful creature had not uttered one word of complaint, but now she faltered forth, "The dear precious lambs! Oh, such a death!" I threw myself down upon the floor beside them, and pressed them alternately to my heart, while inwardly I thanked God that they were asleep, unconscious of danger, and unable by their childish cries to distract our attention from adopting any plan which might offer to effect their escape. The heat soon became suffocating. We were parched with thirst, and there was not a drop of water in the house, and none to be procured nearer than the lake. I turned once more to the door, hoping that a passage might have been burnt through to the water. I saw nothing but a dense cloud of fire and smoke, could hear nothing but the crackling and roaring of the flames, which were gaining so fast upon us that I felt their scorching breath in my face. Ah, thought I, and it was a most bitter thought, what will my beloved husband say when he returns and finds that his poor Susie and his dear girls have perished in this miserable manner? But God can save us yet. The thought had scarcely found a voice in my heart before the wind rose to a hurricane, scattering the flames on all sides into a tempest of burning billows. I buried my head in my apron, for I thought that our time was come, and that all was lost, when a most terrific crash of thunder burst over our heads, and, like the breaking of a waterspout, down came the rushing torrent of rain which had been pent up for so many weeks. In a few minutes the chip-yard was all afloat, and the fire effectually checked. The storm, which, unnoticed by us, had been gathering all day, and which was the only one of any note we had that summer, continued to rage all night, and before morning had quite subdued the cruel enemy, whose approach we had viewed with such dread. The imminent danger in which we had been placed struck me more forcibly after it was past than at the time, and both the girl and myself sank upon our knees, and lifted up our hearts in humble thanksgiving to that God who had saved us, by an act of his providence, from an awful and sudden death. When all hope from human assistance was lost, his hand was mercifully stretched forth, making his strength more perfectly manifested in our weakness. He is their stay when earthly help is lost, the light and anchor of the tempest tossed. There was one person, unknown to us, who had watched the progress of that rash blaze, and had even brought his canoe to the landing, in the hope of us getting off. This was an Irish pensioner named Dunn, who had cleared a few acres on his government grant, and had built a shanty on the opposite shore of the lake. "Faith, madam, and I thought the captain was stark staring mad to fire his fallow on such a windy day, and that blowing right from the lake to the house. When old Wittles came and told us that the master was not to the fore, but only one lad and the wife and the childher at home. Oh, thinks I, there's no time to be lost, or the creatures will be burnt up entirely. We started in Stanther, but by Jove we were too late. The swamp was all in a blaze when we got to the landing, and you might as well have tried to get to heaven by passing through the other place." This was the eloquent harangue with which the honest creature informed me the next morning of the efforts he had made to save us, and the interest he had felt in our critical situation. I felt comforted for my past anxiety by knowing that one human being, however humble, had sympathized in our probable fate, while the providential manner in which we had been rescued will ever remain a theme of wonder and gratitude. The next evening brought the return of my husband, who listened to the tale of our escape with a pale and disturbed countenance, not a little thankful to find his wife and children still in the land of the living. For a long time after the burning of that fallow, it haunted me in my dreams. I would awake with a start, imagining myself fighting with the flames, and endeavouring to carry my little children through them to the top of the clearing, when invariably their garments and my own took fire just as I was within reach of a place of safety. The Forgotten Dream. Ere one ruddy streak of light glimmered o'er the distant height, kindling with its living beam frowning wood and cold grey stream, I awoke with sudden start, clammy brow and beating heart, trembling limbs convulsed and chill, conscious of some mighty ill, yet unable to recall sights that did my sense appall, sounds that thrilled my sleeping ear with unutterable fear, forms that to my sleeping eye presented some strange fantasy, shadowy, spectral, and sublime, that glance upon the sons of time, at moments when the mind o'erwrought yields reason to mysterious thought, and night and solitude in vain bind the free spirit in their chain. Such the vision wild that press'd on tortured brain and heaving chest, but sight and sound alike are gone. I woke and found myself alone, with choking sob and stifled scream, to bless my God 'twas but a dream, to smooth my damp and stiffened hair, and murmur out the Saviour's prayer, the first to grateful memory brought, the first a gentle mother taught, when bending o'er her children's bed, she bade good angels guard my head, then paused with tearful eyes and smiled on the calm slumbers of her child, as God himself had heard her prayer, and holy angels worshipped there. End of chapter 16.